Lion in the Wind, Chapter 29. Delgra studied the laboratory complex with interest through his scope, and then paused when he heard something approaching them rapidly from his left. He turned and spotted Chigani, Itika, and Pen approaching his position. "We came as quickly as we could," said Chigani. "There are only 3 of you. Where are the rest?" Chigani shook his head. "We don't know. We've not seen anyone else in several days, and none of them have responded to our calls." "I believe we are the only ones left," he said. Delgra grunted. "I was hoping that more of you could come. All right, let's hope the others are still alive and can soon join us, or this whole mission could turn ugly real quick." "What would you have us do?" asked Chigani. "Get down there and capture Black. That's the most important goal of this whole operation." Chigani nodded and then motioned for the others to follow. The 3 lions then raced quickly across the prairie towards the facility and soon found themselves taking cover behind a pair of burning LAVs. He studied the situation briefly, and soon spotted a way around the fighting. They quickly sprinted away towards a nearby staircase that led up to the parapets and ascended them with breathtaking speed. Several of Black's men spotted them as they approached and opened fire. But the bullets glanced harmlessly off their armored bodies. The lions charged through the men and quickly scaled the buildings beyond with several large leaps until they found themselves on a roof. They knocked out 2 guards that were protecting a nearby doorway and then raced through it and into the hallway beyond. Chigani called up a set of floor plans he had stored in his memory banks and used them to guide his team through the buildings to the command center. Black turned in surprise as he heard shouts of terror, several short bursts of gunfire, and the sound of shattering wood. Suddenly the door to the command center exploded open in a shower of wood shards. 3 lions stepped into the room a moment later. Upon seeing the lions, the personnel inside panicked and headed for the exits, nearly running each other over in a wild frenzy to get out of the room. Soon only Black remained. He grinned darkly at the lions. "Ah, Chigani. I've been expecting you. And I see you've brought company." "How nice," he said condescendingly. "Give it up, Black." "Your plans are finished," said Chigani. Black laughed. "Really? Well, that's news to me." He then reached into his pocket, pulled out a remote control, and pressed a small button on it. Chigani eyed him suspiciously and then began scanning the room as a sharp whining sound filled his ears. Suddenly, a large, heavily armed robot crashed through the ceiling and landed next to Black. He glanced briefly at the robot, and then back at the lions as he grinned with devilish glee. "Chigani, I would like you to meet the next generation of intelligent weaponry, codenamed Garmek. I am sure the 4 of you can get acquainted very quickly." He then turned to the robot and said, "Kill them." The droid began to walk towards the lions. "Wait," shouted Black a moment later. The droid stopped, and then looked at him mutely. "Do it outside. You've already caused enough damage in here for one day." The droid glared briefly at Black before turning its attention back towards the lions. 6 long, metallic tentacles soon appeared out of its back, and ensnared the lions. It then fired 2 large booster engines and launched itself through the ceiling and out into the night with the lions in tow. Black laughed sadistically. "That was oddly satisfying," he said. Delgra watched in dismay as the battle progressed far slower than he'd wanted. "I think it's time to bring in the 3rd unit," he said. "That's all we've got left," said Odivian. "I know that. But I also know that we're only the sideshow in this carnival. So if we don't keep Black's men busy, the lions won't have a chance." The 3 men climbed into a truck and led the last group of soldiers down the hill and through the main gate. By this time the battle had moved into the main facility, but was progressing very slowly due to the maze-like design of the complex. Even though Delgra had memorized the defensive structure of Black's laboratories, it was still difficult to gain any ground against his defense force. As the 3rd unit rolled into place, they dismounted and began moving forward in an effort to reinforce the beleaguered units in front of them. Word of Delgra's arrival quickly strengthened the resolve of the troops already fighting. With his reinforcements having arrived, they would all now fight even harder to ensure their victory. Fergant pointed at a large metal door in front of him, and said, "Blow it." 2 hunters rushed up to the door, placed several explosive charges, and then quickly sought cover. 2 dull thumps and the sound of crashing metal signaled that the door had been successfully breached. They waited briefly for the smoke to clear and then rushed inside. As they moved into the main administrative building, they were surprised to find that there was almost nobody inside. In the back of their minds, both commanders were glad for this. "While we're here, should we also search for Black?" asked Fergant. "I think that would be a good idea," replied Oik. As they continued on, they surprised several guards, most of which were killed on sight. Even so, one of them managed to survive. Seeing this, Fergant walked over and stood in front of the man. "Where's Black?" he asked gruffly. The man weakly raised an arm and pointed down the hallway. "Operations Center," he said, and then died. Oik spotted a small map that hung on a nearby wall and noted their position. "Fergant, come look at this." The large Gorg commander walked up to the map and studied it. Both the manufacturing facility and the operations center aren't far from here. We should split up and each take a different target," he said. Oik nodded. "I'll take the doctor and go down to the manufacturing facility. You capture Black." Fergant nodded. "I will." "Happy hunting," he said. Oik grinned. The 2 groups then split up and moved down separate hallways en route to their respective targets. As Fergant's team reached the doorway to the operations center, they heard heavy, mechanical footsteps, struggling, and then the roar of powerful rocket engines. The hallway then filled briefly with smoke which quickly dissipated. Everything fell oddly silent. Fergant then signaled to his men who raced forward and burst into the operations center. "Don't move or we'll shoot," said one of the men. Black spun in surprise to see a large group of Gorg soldiers standing just inside the door with their rifles trained on him. He swore. "Bind him," said Fergant. Black let out an evil cackle and then leapt backwards onto a nearby console. "You'll have to catch me first," he shouted. He squatted briefly, and then launched himself through the hole in the ceiling, his cybernetic legs pushing him upwards like a catapult. Fergant cursed. "After him," he shouted. 2 men ran over, clasped their hands together, and gave each of their comrades a boost up through the hole. Fergant was the last. Once everyone was on the roof, several men reached down and lifted the last 2 men up and through the hole. As they did this, Fergant studied the disorienting maze-work of shafts, towers, and ventilation equipment that covered the rooftops around them. Finding his quarry in this mess wasn't going to be easy. He grit his teeth in anger and then signaled for his men to spread out. The 3 lions struggled fiercely against the large metal tentacles that held them. Garmek soon landed, and then threw all 3 of the lions at once towards a nearby concrete wall in hopes of damaging them. But the lions skillfully bounded off the wall and landed gracefully on their feet. They then turned and stared with contempt at the gigantic metal monster. It pointed its 2 giant miniguns at them and began to spin them up. The lions braced themselves, waiting for the guns to fire, fearing that their fight would end right there. But to their surprise the guns remained silent. Garmek repeatedly tried to fire the weapons, but found that they would not work. Realizing that they'd failed due to a regrettable lack of ammunition, it released them and allowed them to crash loudly to the ground. It then raised 2 other weapons on its arms, but got the same results from them also. It dropped them as well as it contemplated its next move. It appears they forgot to arm him. This could play to our advantage. Ithaca, take right flank. Pen, you go left. I've got center, said Chagani over the radio. The 3 lions raced forward towards Garmek as it picked up its useless weapons and hurled them at the lions. The lions easily dodged them and then leapt at him. But their claws glanced off Garmek's armored metal body and did no damage. Chagani was shocked to feel his claws find no purchase on the robot's thick, metallic skin as he slashed wildly at the giant metal monster. Garmek grabbed Chagani with its tentacles and threw him through the air into a large truck that sat nearby, caving in the front of the vehicle. Chagani quickly rebounded and raced back into the battle. Pen latched onto Garmek's back and frantically slashed away at his neck armor as Ithaca attacked its legs. Garmek in turn reached around with its tentacles, grabbed both lions, and threw them across the yard. "We need to destroy those tentacles," said Chagani over the radio. "Got any ideas how to do that?" asked Pen. "I'm working on it," replied Chagani. "Great. So what are we supposed to do in the meantime?" asked Pen. "Just keep fighting." "Oh, yeah. That's a wonderful plan," quipped Pen. Chagani stared at Garmek's tentacles and studied their movements. There had to be a pattern in how they operated that would reveal a weakness in the robot's defenses. "Ithaca, attack its right flank. When it strikes at you, retreat," he said over the radio. "I'm on it," replied Ithaca. She drove in at Garmek with all her speed, but was scooped up in the tentacles as soon as she got close. She struggled vainly to free herself as Garmek spun around and tried to slam her into a nearby wall. Chagani and Pen rushed in to try and save her but quickly found themselves in the same situation. Finding that he had an arm free, Chagani reached around and slashed at the tentacle. His claws made large scratch marks in its metal coating, but did not penetrate it. Again he slashed at them, but did no real damage. But he had at least made an impact on the robot's armor. His tentacles are. He paused as his body slammed against a wall and was immediately yanked back. Vulnerable to R. Again he struck the wall and was pulled back. Claws, continued Chagani. He felt his body impact another reinforced concrete wall. He struggled fiercely to free himself, but found that he could not. Seeing that Chagani was trapped, Garmek plodded towards him with the intention of finishing off the struggling lion. But before it could, Pen leapt at the giant robot, distracting it long enough for Ithaca to race over to Chagani. She quickly assessed the situation, and then began attacking the concrete around her brother with her claws. But despite her best efforts, she wasn't making much progress. Just then Chagani shouted, "Watch out!" Instinctively Ithaca leapt to the side, and to her surprise watched, out of the corner of her eye, as a large slab of concrete came flying her way and impacted the wall. It had been Garmek's intention to smash her with it. But much to Garmek's chagrin, it had instead further cracked the concrete wall, allowing Chagani to extricate himself. Seeing that her brother was free, Ithaca hurried over to him. "Are you all right?" Chagani nodded. "I am fine. However, we need to help our brother. He cannot fight this monster alone." "Agreed." Oik peered around the corner and spied Elgar as he spoke with several scientists. "Mr. Black wants you to begin production immediately," said Elgar. "But we're not ready." "It'll be another 2 days before we can begin production," said one of the scientists. "Make it 20 minutes or I start putting holes in people's heads." "Got it?" Oik pulled back and leaned over to one of his men. "Elgar's out there. We should bag ourselves a prize," he said with a grin. The hunter nodded. Oik leaned around the corner again, held up his hand, and then signaled for the first group to move. A squad of men immediately rushed out into the middle of the room. "Get your hands up! Get your hands up!" they shouted. Elgar turned around in surprise to see Oik's hunters standing behind him. Whether out of reflex or pure fear, he foolishly drew his pistol and tried to shoot. But he never got the chance, as the hunters cut him down immediately. He staggered briefly and then collapsed. "Get down on the ground," shouted one of the hunters as they corralled the frightened scientists into a corner. Oik walked cautiously over to Elgar's perforated body and examined it. He kicked the gun out of Elgar's hand and studied the man's hollow, horrified expression. He grunted and turned around to see Bergen and Persia hurrying across the room to a small control booth nearby. "Doctor, is this our target?" he asked. "Yes, it is. We need to destroy it so that Black can't build his robotic army," said Bergen. "How fast can you do that?" "I don't know." "Let me see what I can do," said Bergen. He began to work with the controls in earnest, and then after several minutes shook his head. The controls are locked out. If it starts up, we won't be able to stop it. Oik looked at the scientists, and said, "What's the security key?" Just then a group of Black's guards poured through a nearby doorway and began shooting. Oik's men immediately returned fire and cut them down. "Secure that entrance," shouted Oik as he pointed to the door. He then turned back to the scientists and grimaced in dismay as his eyes fixed on their bullet-riddled bodies. He grunted. "Doctor, how quickly can you unlock those controls?" "It'll take me at least several hours," said Bergen. Oik growled in frustration. "Then we'll need to blow it up. Do you know of any weak points this place has?" Bergen studied the facility around them and sighed anxiously. "Nothing specifically, but I know of a few things that might work. Anything will help." "All right, this way then." Brakeman sat nervously in the front seat of the old army truck he'd stolen from Black's facility and watched the road ahead as it barreled down the highway at breakneck speed. He hadn't expected to ever see the truck again, or even come out of hiding until all the hostilities were over. But Mashwa had other plans. He'd first led Brakeman to the truck, and then sent him off to aid his brother in the coming fight at Black's northern laboratory. But that wasn't what bothered him the most. It was the other things Mashwa had told him. He kept running their conversation through his head over and over again as they flew down the road like a runaway train. He tried to get Mashwa to explain his message. But regardless of what he did, Mashwa would not give up any more secrets. All Brakeman knew was that his parents were already there, and he would need to get to Black's facility as fast as possible to help them win the day. He pondered Mashwa's words some more. If they're somewhere in that facility, they could be killed in the fighting. No. If anyone is to die, it should be me. It's my job to protect them. That's why I'm here, isn't it? I can't let them die. I just wish this bucket of bolts would move faster, he thought. Just then they crested a hill not far from the facility and saw a sight that made him gasp in horror. The facility was awash in flames and the signs of battle. Brakeman swore. By the heart of Mashwa, no, he thought. Keep that pedal all the way down. We must save my parents, he shouted as he climbed out onto the hood. Silently under his breath, he prayed that he would arrive in time.